But that brings us to what the second user was saying earlier, and it turns out that he said, if there is something that we could do to protect Izuku Midoriya, and that connects with Bakugo and the final panel saying, so we're seeing Izuku approaching his breaking point in this chapter, I guess, and I also think we're coming to like the absolute closest of him becoming an anti-hero, and I say closest because I don't think he'll ever become like a full-blown anti-hero, but what we've been seeing in this arc is what I think Horikoshi's like attempt is at something like that. Maybe like the core of Izuku as a character will never, like fully go in that direction, but at least he can have like the aesthetic of it, because that's another thing, is that we're seeing Izuku have like a full-blown like villain aesthetic, and I'll get into that. But instead of him like performing morally questionable actions, it's just that he's obsessed and he's like burning the candle at both ends. And also like at first people are afraid of him, so that adds to it, I guess. But that goes back to the villain aesthetic that I was talking about, because it's on display in a pretty cool way in this chapter. And we saw the start of it in the previous chapter, but it was really put on spotlight in the final panel of the previous chapter when we saw like Izuku in his dark villain-esque form, which is basically just an unintentional result of like the lifestyle that he's been living. But that combined with like how far he's come like power and ability wise, especially with Black Whip, those two things together give him like this very, villain-esque monstrous appearance, because like Black Whip is now like coming out of him. Like he no longer really has to like shoot it from his hands or something. He's almost like Doc Ock with it at this point, which like I said shows how far he's come and how powerful he is right now. That along with his current villain aesthetic really just adds to it and makes people just fear him straight up when they first see him. But going back to burning the candle at both ends, that's pretty much the theme of this chapter. Like Izuku is approaching a breaking point. He's living this unattainable lifestyle where he's just constantly on the go. The way that it's been portrayed for the last couple chapters, that he's kind of been living like danger sense to danger sense. Like it'll trigger, then he'll go off and deal with whatever the issue was, and then he'll just wait for the next one and he'll keep doing that. I'm not even really sure if he's even been sleeping or anything during this whole entire time, or at least it's implied that he's been getting little, if any. And we're seeing everyone around him is like really worried about him. Like even Endeavor in this chapter is worried about him. We saw previously that All Might was, of course, the most worried about him. And the way that Izuku has become obsessed has led to like a minor falling out between them, to where he just straight up left, All Might. At that point, it was revealed that Stain was like behind the wall near him, which is unfortunately not touched on in this chapter. I was really excited to see what was going to happen with that, but no, Horikoshi hit us with the swerve, and we're just going to have to wait to see what happened. But anyway, the Vestiges are also worried about him, and we see them like talking amongst themselves, and it seems like most of them are on the same page with wanting him to like pretty much take a break, stop not being so obsessed about everything, except for one of them, and that is the second user. And he says he shouldn't be allowed to stop, especially in a situation like this. That's what it means to wield One for All and carry on our wills. But perhaps, and then it cuts off there, and we don't find out what he says until the very end. But I think it's understandable why this guy feels this way, because what we know of him, or at least what's been shown so far, is that he came from like a hardcore time, therefore he is kind of like a hardcore byproduct of it. And he was also like the leader of the resistance against All for One, I guess, so he also had that whole thing going on. But obviously there's still a huge mystery to this guy. We, hardly know anything about him really, but I also think it's interesting that he's so like gung-ho about One for All. Like this guy was the one who discovered Yoriichi, and if it wasn't for him, One for All wouldn't have been able to make it this far, obviously. But we're going to be talking about this guy in a little bit, because like I said, it's revealed what he says at the ending, and then that connects to a whole other can of worms. So we're cutting to Izuku going to like another Danger Sense location, and we're seeing like his internal monologue of him like obsessing about going after One for All and trying to save everyone, and he just wants to go back to normal, and he just wants to smile with everyone again. But the thing that I like most in this sequence is that it shows All Might and All for One both pointing at him saying, "You're next," which is just a great way to show how much pressure is actually on Izuku. It's like God and the devil saying like, "Hey, you're next up." But towards the end of this chapter, Izuku winds up running into one of the Tartarus escapees by the name of Dictator, who is also working with All for One. He also points out that All for One also predicted that that Izuku is going to become obsessed and everything. So mark another one on the board for things that All For One knew was going to happen ahead of time. That whole aspect of him has really been like hammered home like after the war. But this dictator guy seems to have like a quirk that's like a fusion between trumpets and shinsos, to where like trumpet can affect multiple people at once, but it seems like the dictator has like these strings, it looks like, that they're connected to people maybe. So maybe he kind of like has like a Daffy type thing on, if you're familiar with One Piece and his parasecto or whatever parasite string thing he was doing. But he's controlling like a whole bunch of civilians. But unlike Shinso's quirk, they don't like become zombies. They're still fully conscious, but I guess he just has control over like their physical actions. So under the control of Dictator, they all go after Izuku and start like fighting him, but of course he can't fight back, and now he's kind of stuck in this situation until suddenly Bakugo shows up. Yes, Bakugo is finally back. Very excited to see him. And he hits the dictator in the head with an AP shot, and then he says, "I found him, guys." So that implies that Class 1A has in fact been looking for Izuku, and it totally makes sense because he gave all of them that goodbye letter at the beginning of the arc. And since we know these characters well at this point, they're obviously not just gonna sit back and not go look for him. Especially Bakugo of all people. But that brings us to what the second user was saying earlier, and it turns out that he said, if there is something that we could do to protect Izuku Midoriya, and that connects with Bakugo in the final panel saying, "I found him, guys." So that's really interesting, right? That the second user is specifically pointing out Bakugo here, or at least it's implied that he is, and that's because of the whole big time travel theory that's been going on for a couple years that theorizes that the second user is in fact Bakugo, who goes back in time so that One For All can be passed on. But most likely, for now, I'll say, the second user is probably saying this because the Vestiges occasionally vicariously live through Izuku, so they're aware of his surroundings and who he has relationships with, and they also even feel his feelings. So he could just be picking Bakugo because he knows, based on that information, that he's the best person to be with Izuku right now to continue on with his mission. Or if you want to get a little, spicy, you could say it's because he is Bakugo and there's no one better to be with Izuku right now than the former version of me. I don't know. I'm really curious to see where things are headed for sure, but let me know what you think about this chapter in the comments, guys. And if you liked the video, please give it a like, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day. I'll see you in the next one.